Good morning, students. How are you all? Fine. Okay, very good. Students, now is the session of economics. Okay. In the previous session, we had discussed about the quantitative control measures of the central bank to control the supply of money. These measures are adopted by the central bank to control, regulate and direct the supply of money in an economy. Okay. As we have seen in the previous sessions that the commercial banks are engaged in creating credit. This is their business. Okay. But if this credit creation process continues for a long and goes beyond a limit, then it creates inflationary pressure on the economy. And sometimes it becomes necessary for the central bank to control this credit creation capacity of the commercial banks. And the central bank is authorized to adopt some of the measures or to use some monetary measures to control credit creating activities of the commercial bank, and these measures are classified into the two categories which are called quantitative control measures and qualitative control measures. Okay. Under quantitative control measures we include the two policy rates, the two policy ratios and open market operation. The two policy rates as bank rate, repo rate, reverse repo rate, etc. we have discussed in the previous session. Today we would like to discuss the other measures of quantitative control method, which are called the two policy measures and open market operations. Okay, so let us discuss them one by one respectively. You know, students, the two policy ratios are called cash reserve ratio and a statutory liquidity ratio. In fact, the cash reserve ratio is called CRR in short, and the SLR is called statutory liquidity ratio is called SLR in short. Okay. You know, these two ratios are the ratios of deposits with the commercial banks, which have to be kept as reserve either with the central bank or with the commercial bank themselves. And the commercial banks usually have to maintain this ratio as per directives and instructions given by the central bank. It is legally compulsory. Okay. Let us first discuss about the cash reserve ratio, that is called CRR. Okay. This is the minimum ratio of total deposits with a commercial bank which has to be kept with the central bank. Okay. And time to time the central bank varies this ratio, which affects the supply of money in the economy or which influences credit creating capacity of the commercial banks. How? Let us see. When there is an inflationary pressure on the economy, then usually the central bank, the RBI, raises this ratio. And if this ratio is raises, then the commercial banks have little amount of reserve of cash to do business or to create credit. Okay. So automatically, because the credit creating capacity is reduced by raising the CRR, thus automatically the supply of money reduces and inflation is under control. Okay. Similarly, when there is deflation in the economy, then the central bank lowers this ratio. And the commercial banks now have surplus reserve of cash, enough reserve of cash to create credit. Okay. So by varying this ratio time to time as per requirement of the economy, the central bank in fact makes an effort to control money supply. But by making variations in this ratio in order to affect the money supply in the economy has some of its limitations. As for example, if the commercial banks are having a larger amount of reserve of cash with them, then even by changing this ratio, their credit creating capacity cannot be affected. Okay, this is the limitation of this ratio. Okay, the second important ratio is called a statutory liquidity ratio called SLR. This is the ratio of deposits with the commercial banks which have to be kept by them in the form of liquid assets like gold, in the form of approved securities and in cash. In fact, the commercial banks are instructed to maintain this ratio so that they could maintain their withdrawals liability properly. Okay. Students, when there is inflation like situation in the economy, then the central bank normally raises this ratio. As soon as the ratio SLR is raised by the central bank, then the commercial banks automatically have less amount of the reserve of cash to create credit. Okay. The same way, when there is deflation like situation in the economy, then the central bank lowers this ratio. And as soon as this ratio is lowered, then the commercial banks have sufficient surplus cash with them to create credit. Okay. So by varying SLR also, the central bank can influence the credit creating capacity of the commercial banks. Okay. The third important quantitative control measure is open market operations. Okay. What do you mean by open market operations? In fact, this is the measure through which government's approved securities are either sold or purchased by the central bank through commercial banks. Okay. When there is inflationary pressure on the economy, then the central bank starts selling the securities like NSC, Indira Vikas Patra, Kisan Vikas Patra, etc. at higher rate of interest. Okay, so that the people can buy them. And by selling these securities, the central bank in fact soaks liquidity from the economy, which reduces aggregate demand, resulting into reduction in inflation. Okay, just reverse is done when there is deflation. What happens when there is a deflation? The central bank starts buying these securities, okay, by paying high rate of interest so that the people may have sufficient cash with them to make demands in the market. Aggregate demand will increase, leading to a control of deflation. Okay, so this is also a way of controlling the money supply in the economy, either by selling the securities or by buying the securities. When the securities are sold, then the liquidity is soaked by the central bank, and when the securities are purchased, then liquidity is released by the central bank. Okay. So till now we have discussed the quantitative control, credit control measures of the central bank. Now we shall discuss the qualitative credit control measures of the central bank. You know, students, the qualitative control measures are adopted by the central bank not to affect overall supply of the economy, but to affect the flow of money supply in selected areas. Okay. And the first qualitative credit control instrument is the change in margin requirement. Okay. Do you understand what is called margin requirement? Margin requirement is the difference between the value of the assets mortgaged and the amount of loan to be taken from the commercial bank. Okay. As for example, if a person gets a loan of rupees 80,000 by mortgaging his house of suppose rupees 1 lakh, then here it will be called 20,000. The difference between the values of these two is equal to 20,000, and it will be called as margin requirement. Okay. What happens when there is inflation in the economy? The central bank raises this requirement so that the borrowings from the commercial banks become costlier, and the people can make less demand in the market. That will help in checking the inflation. And when there is deflation in the economy, then this margin requirement is lowered so that people can borrow maximum from the commercial banks to increase their demand, and that will lead to control of deflation. Okay. So by varying margin requirement also, the central bank can contribute to control of the money supply in the economy. And usually this instrument is used by the central bank to control a speculative trading. Okay. The next important qualitative control measure is rationing of credits. Okay. What happens under it? When there is inflation, high inflation in the economy, then the central bank fixes the quotas for different commercial banks to create credit. That means any commercial bank is not allowed to create credit beyond that fixed quota. Okay. And if a commercial bank creates credit beyond the limit of that quota, then the central bank takes legal action against it. Okay. And when there is a deflation in the economy, then these quotas are not fixed by the central bank, so that the commercial banks can create credit freely. Okay. The next important qualitative credit control measure is supposed to be moral suasion, which includes the two acts of the central bank which are used to pressurize the commercial banks to create less credit. In fact, the moral suasion includes the policies of persuasion and pressure. When the central bank adopts the policy of persuasion, then it gives an advisory to the commercial banks not to create credit more during inflation. And if the commercial banks do not accept these advices, do not follow these suggestions, then the central bank also creates a pressure on them, that is called the policy of pressure not to create credit more. Okay, and if a commercial bank does not obey this instruction, then the central bank can take legal action against the commercial bank. Okay, so these were some of the important qualitative control, credit control measures adopted by the central bank. Okay, and along with this, the chapter of banking I have completed. I would like to advise you to go through this chapter very carefully, and if you have any confusion and queries, then must discuss with me. Okay, thank you.